Dr. Schlimgen is a historian of the modern United States whose research focuses on U.S. citizenship and constitutionalism, the experiences of racial and ethnic Americans, U.S. expansion and empire, and the Pacific world. These interests inform the courses she teaches, which include a survey of modern world history and, recently, a course on activism and protest in the United States. She teaches advanced courses in history, in international studies, in solidarity and social justice, and in women and gender studies at Gonzaga University. She's also a public historian. Now let's welcome her, and I'll give her the podium to her.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brandy. And I want to join her in thanking the City of Boise, the Department of Arts and History that invited me here, as well as the Office of the Mayor, Boise State Public Radio, and the Department of History at Boise State University for bringing me here. So to start, I want to draw your attention to the news that you no doubt encountered over the past 3 or 4 months, because if you encountered any news at all, then you already know that women were a significant part of the 2018 campaign season and the election. In fact, our news sources want us to know that an unprecedented number of women ran for public office and an unprecedented number of them won office. Given these electoral victories, and in light of the very public marches that women have organized over the past 2 years, we might think that we're in the midst of an important historic event, the unprecedented participation by American women in politics. But if we were to fall prey to that assumption, we would be wrong, because this is not a precedent that we recently broke. It's a precedent we broke a very long time ago. So tonight I want to direct our attention to that history, to the history of women's activism and social reform in politics that took place about a century ago. My argument is that these historic, I know, I think that I'm getting double, so I'm going to stand over here and see if that helps with the sound. But let me know if it doesn't, and I will station myself at that microphone. So my argument about these historic women is that they were indeed unprecedented because of the sheer number of American women who became active in public. And as I relate to you some of their stories, I have other arguments about women activists. For example, these women sought reform in things that related to their own lives. And the reforms that they achieved over a century ago shaped the lives that we live today. And finally, their activism helps us to better understand and appreciate politics in 2018. So often when we think about women activists from 1900, we think of suffragists, of those women who agitated for the right to vote. We know that women suffrage advocates worked for decades to achieve the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. Some of the first successes, in fact, for all the wrong reasons, occurred in the West, in the region that we inhabit. The territory of Wyoming was the first to franchise women in 1869. They were followed by the Utah Territory in 1870. They had to do it again when they became a state in 1896. In the 1890s, though, two major victories were Colorado and Idaho that franchised women in 1893 and 1896. The long campaign for women's suffrage is an inspiring story, but it isn't the entire story of women's activism. Sometimes we assume that it was. We may have the impression that voting was the only thing or that it was the most important thing that women activists were working on, and that was simply not the case. So I want to put suffrage in context alongside the other reform campaigns that women were engaged in as part of the progressive movement. How's it sound? Okay. So if we're going to talk about the progressive movement and that era very long ago, we need to identify what it was. The progressive movement was underway by the 1880s, and it lasted to the 1920s or so. It was characterized by activism, by individuals like Theodore Roosevelt, who's caricatured here, and also by groups like the National Consumers League that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. These were people who worked to improve society, the workplace, politics, and government, so basically everything. Progressivism was a response to rapid changes that were occurring in the United States, and a sense by Americans that they were losing control of their society, workplaces, government, and politics. So in order to appreciate this, I'll just give you a very quick overview of the rapid changes that were happening in the United States in the late 19th century after the Civil War. One of these was the acceleration of industrialization. Lots more factories that could accommodate many more workers, and then many more sites of industrial labor that included mines, like the mines that you see spring up and almost overnight here in Idaho. This was accompanied by a transition to all free labor. After the Civil War, the United States became a country that only had free labor legally. Married to this, the growth of industry, is the rapid influx of millions of immigrants. When the Civil War ended, up until the start of World War I, the U.S. experienced massive immigration from Europe and, to a certain degree, from Asia. Those immigrants took jobs in factories and in mines, and they ended up in cities. And so another one of the changes was rapidly expanding cities throughout the United States. The success of industry also led to concentrations of wealth and power. The captains of industry who were building these factories and making a lot of money, they used that money because they could. They used it to maybe slip to the mayor so that the mayor wouldn't send the safety inspector to their factory. So wealth and power also led to government corruption. And that is related to unsafe working conditions, hazards in these workplaces, in these factories and these mines. Unsafe job sites, but also unsafe buildings and cramped living quarters, the places where all of these workers lived. So progressives thought they could reform these problems by direct engagement. And they were part of a broad spectrum of reformers. You see Big Bill Haywood there in the upper left. He was a union organizer. He thought that he could improve mine safety for mine workers by organizing the workers. Teddy Roosevelt, who thought you could use government and law in order to improve the health and safety of food. You also see J.P. Morgan, who wanted to work with industrial workers in order to settle disputes and make sure they had safe work sites. And then W.E.B. Du Bois thought that you could study a problem like deficits in education and improve them. But among these progressive reformers were thousands of women progressives. And it's these women that I want to focus on. In fact, to get us started, I want to refer to an example that you're probably familiar with, the example of settlement houses, the most famous of which was Hull House in Chicago. These settlement houses were significant to women progressives, but also to the communities that they served. Excuse me. They provided basic necessities, but also quality of life to the industrial working class communities where these settlement houses were located. So, for example, some of the basic necessities that they provided were boarding houses. They provided rooms for people who were looking for housing and couldn't find it. Settlement houses like Hull House, they also provided an employment bureau. So someone who was unemployed, had skills, they could go to the settlement house and connect to a job. Settlement houses also provided some quality of life. They provided libraries and reading rooms, lending libraries and reading rooms, which is what you see in the lower right, an image of Hull House's reading room. They had art galleries and music schools, understanding that the arts were important to quality of life. Settlement houses also provided legal services, so a working person who didn't get the wages that they were promised from their employer and didn't know what to do could go to find legal services at the settlement house. The settlement houses also provided health care. They provided free or low-cost health clinics. They provided pharmacies for people who needed to buy medication. And they also provided vaccinations and immunizations, which is what you see depicted in this image in the middle. So why, you might be asking yourself, why did women decide to do this work? Why this moment? And there are several factors involved. One of them is that in the post-Civil War period, a lot more women were going to college. College-educated women were often not content going to their homes and becoming wives and mothers exclusively. They thought they had skills and abilities that society could use. And part of the reason they believed society could use their skills was because of this concept that they believed in called social housekeeping. So social housekeeping is the idea that women have special abilities that men did not have. This is a very gendered argument women were making. So for example, these women said that men didn't know the needs of children, and they didn't know the best way to maintain a household. And for this reason, men needed women. They needed women to provide them with insight into how to construct laws that would protect children and how to create clean food so that households could be protected. Again, they said only women knew how to do this because of some biological proclivity. And they also said that women were really good at cleaning, so women could clean up government. Women said, you men need us so that we can help clean up government corruption, which, by the way, men caused. In fact, Jane Addams, the famous founder of Hull House, she said that government needs the help of minds accustomed to a sense of responsibility for the cleanliness and comfort of other people. And clearly, she meant women. One of these progressive social housekeeping women was Florence Kelley. So this is the first of 4 examples. I'm going to give you 4 profiles of these progressive women activists. Florence Kelley started in activism in a very typical way. She was a college-educated woman, but Florence Kelley was exceptional and remarkable. She is one of the most successful women activists of the progressive era, and she took up the cause of unsafe working conditions. Kelley was born, as I've noted here, in 1859 in Pennsylvania. She was born into an activist family. They were all Republicans, and they were all strong abolitionists. So Kelley was born into an activist tradition. She went to college. She studied social sciences at Cornell. And she came to realize that the lives of working Americans, which didn't include her, she didn't work in a factory, but she developed deep empathy for working people. And she came to realize that working Americans had lives that were difficult and unpleasant. She came to believe that the workplace could be improved and changed for the better, and that she needed to work on exactly this problem. So Kelley decided the best way to achieve reform was to study the problem, to create reform, and to join the Socialist Party. And this is an important piece of the story that we have to keep in mind. A number of progressive reformers joined socialism because socialism resonated with them and with other Americans in the late 19th century. Socialism responded to problems that they saw all around them, to problems of dangerous jobs, of poverty pay, of overcrowding in homes and on factory floors, and of very, very, very long shifts at work. So Kelley and other socialists believed that the reforms they needed were to provide everyone who worked, that is, everyone who contributed to the economy, should earn wages that fulfilled first their material needs, right? They have shelter and they have food, but those wages should also allow them to live with dignity. And living with dignity meant that they should have some time away from work when they were awake. So they shouldn't work every waking moment of their lives. They should have leisure time. And when they had leisure time, they should be able to enjoy it. They should be able to go to church or learn about music or appreciate art or paint art or enjoy the outdoors. That this was an expression of their dignity as human beings. This was a value that Kelley shared with socialists. Socialists also wanted to decrease the pay gap between the poorest workers and the captains of industry. And one way that she and other socialists thought they could achieve these goals was with new laws that would set wages and that would fulfill the values that Americans placed in their work. So Kelly set to work on this. And in, excuse me, and in 1889, Florence Kelly went to Chicago and lived in Hull House. She began a 40-plus-year career working on the safety of laborers. And one of her first jobs was with the Illinois Bureau of Labor and the U.S. Department of Labor. The work that she did was research. She went into factories in Chicago, and she observed the working conditions. She also ended up in tenement buildings, that is, in residences, in apartment buildings where immigrant workers lived, where working class people lived, because that's where they did a lot of their work. She collected a lot of data. Let's see, oh yeah, there she is at Hull House, there we go. And she collected a lot of data on the situation of immigrant workers and of working class people. And this gives you just an illustration of the types of things Florence Kelly observed. The children who are manning machines in a textile mill, and then the family doing piecework in their home, in their apartment. They would go to the manufacturer, they would get pieces of clothing or shoes that needed to be stitched together. They took them home, they stitched them, they brought them back, and they got paid by the piece. That's tenement labor. So Kelly took the observations from these places, from factories and tenements, and she worked with lawmakers in Illinois to craft legislation to protect workers. And in 1893, Illinois passed some of these path-breaking laws. The laws that they passed in 1893 were, first of all, to ban the labor of children under the age of 14. So those kids are going to be out of a job. The state of Illinois also regulated the labor of children between the ages of 14 and 16. It outlawed the stitching of garments in tenements. So the family working from home, their job site is going to shift to a factory floor. They won't be taking their labor home. It limited the workday for women and children to 8 hours, and the state created an office to enforce these laws. And the first thing the governor did after he signed this legislation into law was to hire Florence Kelly as the first chief factory inspector in Illinois to make sure that factories were complying with these laws. This was historic. Florence Kelly was the first woman appointed to enforce legislation by a U.S. state. And some scholars claim the first one in the history of the world. A few years later, after the political winds shifted in Illinois, a new governor came into office and said, we don't need you anymore, Florence Kelly. She shifted jobs. She started to work for the National Consumers League. And the National Consumers League, it was not a government agency. It was a private organization. It endeavored to improve the working conditions of average Americans by appealing to consumers, the people who bought the stuff they made. So here's how they operated. The National Consumers League asked consumers to only buy goods from factories that didn't exploit their workers. And the way that they did this was to send a National Consumer League inspector into the factories, and they would check for hours. The factory couldn't work their workers longer than 10 hours. They couldn't employ children, and they could not require overtime. And if the inspector found that the factory complied with all of these demands, then they gave the factory these white labels. The labels were stitched into the garments, and consumers looked for the white label when they bought goods, so they could make sure they were not buying goods that were made by exploited workers or sweatshop workers. The research that Kelly did for the National Consumer League and for the state of Illinois and for the national government turned out to be really, really significant, because Kelly used this research to support states as they tried to create labor laws that employers did not like and that employers tried to crush. And so Florence Kelly is significant to my last example related to Florence Kelly, and that is a lawsuit against the state of Oregon. So in 1903, the state of Oregon passed a maximum hour law for women. They said women who work in the state of Oregon cannot work longer than 10 hours a day. And Kurt Muller, he's one of the guys in that shop. I don't know if he's the one on the left or the right. But Kurt Muller owned and operated a laundry in Portland, Oregon. And Kurt Muller looked at this law and he said, the state of Oregon can't tell me how long I can hire my workers to work. So he made the women in his laundry work longer than 10 hours. He wanted to be found out, and he was. He was cited, he was fined, and then he sued the state of Oregon, arguing that the state had no authority to tell him how long his employers could work. So when they did this, Florence Kelley went to work for the state of Oregon indirectly. Who she really worked for was the guy there in the middle, Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis was the lawyer that Oregon hired to try to defend their maximum hour law. And Florence Kelley provided Louis Brandeis with reams of evidence that detailed the negative health effects of long work days on workers' bodies, especially women workers, because that's what this law pertained to. And in 1907, the Supreme Court heard Kelley's evidence and Brandeis's argument, and they agreed. They were persuaded by all of this evidence. The court said that working women needed laws to limit the hours, limit their shifts, so that employers couldn't obligate them to work long and unhealthy hours. This case was one of the most pivotal Supreme Court decisions of the progressive era, and it's something progressives achieved because of Florence Kelley, because of her dogged research and her lifelong commitment to creating safe workplaces for workers. So where Florence Kelley's activism was centered on workers, the activism of Ida B. Wells was focused on crime, or on crime prevention. Wells campaigned in opposition to lynching and in favor of black suffrage, and these two were interconnected. I'll explain how. Just like Kelley, though, Ida B. Wells faced an uphill battle. Wells had a different background than Kelley. Wells was born in 1862. She was born in Mississippi, so she was born into slavery. She became free in 1865 when the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution and outlawed slavery in the United States. Wells, then living free, moved to Tennessee. Her family moved to Tennessee, and her father, who was a carpenter, he served on the Board of Regents for Rust College, and so that's where Ida B. Wells went to college. After college, Wells moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where she joined a thriving African-American community, Memphis in the 1880s. She was very happy there. She taught Sunday school, and she wrote newspaper stories for the local Baptist paper. But then in 1892, tragedy struck. 3 of Wells' friends owned a local grocery store. It was called the People's Grocery. This was a really successful grocery store in Memphis, and it catered to the African-American community. This grocery store, though, it was more successful than the white-owned grocery store across the street. And one evening, white residents assembled and protested outside of the People's Grocery. They became confrontational and violent. Fists were thrown, and the police showed up. When the police showed up, they arrested the 3 black men who owned the grocery store and no one else. They arrested them for causing violence, public violence. While they were in police custody, a mob of whites went to the jail. They demanded these 3 men. They received them from the police at the jail, and then they lynched them. Wells was devastated. Her friends had no protection from the law or from law enforcement. They had committed no crime. Her friends died because they transgressed the practices of Jim Crow white supremacy that emerged in the United States after the Civil War. This Jim Crow white supremacy dictated that black Americans would not enjoy economic opportunities or equality before the law. Wells's friends were murdered because they were successful in business, and no one was arrested for the crime. As Wells mourned their deaths, she became outraged that American ideals of freedom and equality didn't apply to black Americans. So she began to research and to write. She published a booklet titled Southern Horrors in the same year that her friends had been lynched. And in this book, she detailed the stories of dozens of black men and even a few black women who were lynched by white mobs. and no one was ever prosecuted for the crime. Wells pointed out that these mobs justified the extralegal murder with claims that black men raped white women. And Wells' evidence showed that this just was not true. Wells found that some victims were like her friends. They owned property or they enjoyed success in the growing US economy, and that's why they were lynched. In other cases, Wells found that victims had consensual and sometimes loving interracial relationships. But in the Jim Crow era of segregation, whites did not allow this. So they attacked any black man suspected of catching the attention of a white woman or black men who were economically successful. Wells not only provided evidence of their innocence, she also wrote in a powerful way, and she indicted white Southerners of composing a lie of rape to cover over their own crimes. And this is just one excerpt from Southern Horrors, but it gives you a sense of the language that she used. She was referring to her newspaper editorial that really got the ball rolling, and she said, "My editorial was prompted by the many inhumane and fiendish lynchings of Afro-Americans that have taken place." What she does in this line and in other parts of Southern Horrors is she characterizes white Southern men as inhumane, as fiends, as insatiably violent, as irrational, and as opposed to the law, essentially as criminals. So, given what she's saying, can you imagine how it was received by the white community in Memphis where she lived? She had to leave town quickly under the threat of death. But she didn't stop. She continued to write. She moved to New York City, she moved to London, and finally she ended up in Chicago, where she continued to be the driving force behind the anti-lynching campaign in the United States. In fact, there we go. In fact, she was part of a coalition of white and black progressives who in 1909 created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, that was very recognizable. After the creation of the NAACP, she made sure that this organization kept the crime of lynching front and center in the minds of Americans. And this picture you see on the right is at the offices of the NAACP in New York City. When they got news, which they did, of a criminal lynching of a black man or woman, they put this flag out so that anyone passing by would know. So they made very public the campaign against lynching and the consciousness of this crime that was repeatedly committed in the United States. Wells's support for women's right to vote was connected to this anti-lynching campaign. She believed that if women got the right to vote, that would support her campaign against lynching. She reasoned that if women, especially black women, could vote, they would vote in favor of elected officials, of candidates who opposed lynching. So Wells' support for women's right to vote highlights one of the contradictions of progressivism. Because while Wells, and she's the person in the middle, this is a grainy picture, I know, but it comes from a newspaper, so this is as good as it gets. So Wells, her support for women's right to vote was directly worked against, was contradictory to other activist women, especially white Southern activist women, who were advocating for literacy tests. And that's what you see depicted in the cartoon there in the middle. Literacy tests were ways that white Southerners worked to limit the franchise. And so their reasoning, the reason why they thought this was a progressive cause, their thinking was that only someone who has basic educational attainment or achievement should be allowed to vote. And so a literacy test seemed like a good measure of whether or not someone had a basic education, a basic qualification to vote. So white Southern women supported literacy tests, which we know were exploited and used to restrict the vote and keep black men from voting. The success of literacy tests alongside women's suffrage activism shows us that women activists sometimes worked against each other. They didn't all want the same reforms, but they were actively engaged in seeking their own particular reform. My third example of a progressive woman activist also advocated for reforms that other women opposed. Zicala Essa was a writer, a composer, and a reformer. And so let me tell you a little bit more about her so you can appreciate how, in some respects, she worked against the grain. Zicala Essa was born in 1876 on the Yankton Agency in South Dakota. She was Yankton Sioux. When she was 8 years old, she was sent away to an Indian boarding school in Indiana. This was a very unhappy period in her life, but despite the fact that she did not like the boarding school, she continued with her education. After she finished at the, it was called, White's Manual Labor Institute. So you know what they were teaching her. They were teaching her how to be a good worker. Despite her experiences at the Indian boarding school, she decided to continue her education. She attended Earlham College in Indiana, and then she studied at the New England Conservatory of Music. She was a violinist. When she was done at the New England Conservatory, she returned to the Yankton Reservation in South Dakota. And it was there that she resumed her education as a Yankton. She learned Yankton traditions and stories, Yankton religion and language, and she started to collect and amass the stories of her community. She married a few years later, and she ended up at the Ute Reservation, coincidentally, so maybe a few hundred miles from here. And when she was relocated to the Ute Reservation with her family, she began writing. She compiled the stories of Sioux traditions, and she wrote her autobiography at the tender age of 26. So if you're 26 or older, you're a little bit behind. You need to get started on your autobiography. Zicala Essa also began to write for magazines, and she wrote about the plight of Native Americans. Her powerful writing appealed to readers. So they really found it engaging and insightful. It was something they had never read before. She gave them a window into the lives of Native Americans. She, in fact, in her autobiography, I'll show you an excerpt here so you can see her style of writing. Here she's writing about her experience at the boarding school when she was first inducted into the school. And she's talking about getting her hair cut. She says, "In spite of myself, I was carried downstairs and tied fast to a chair. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck, and I heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids." She continued, "Then I lost my spirit. Now my long hair was shingled like that of a coward's." This very emotional experience for Zicala Essa was something she was able to communicate in her autobiography. And it was something that appealed to other progressive activists who read her story. Some of them followed her lead. She started to criticize Indian boarding schools, and she criticized the broader effort to educate, eradicate Native traditions, Native languages, and Native religions. And so this is where Zicala Essa came into conflict with other progressives. She believed that Native Americans should preserve their traditions, but not all progressives did. Some progressive women, thought it was better for Native people to abandon their traditions and assimilate and become just like what in their mind was very clearly white America. They had a clear concept of it. This is why they kept building Indian boarding schools, and this is why they kept populating them with Native children. Nevertheless, Zicala Essa was convincing enough that she gained enough support among progressive activists that they were able to pressure Congress, and Congress paid attention. So in the 1920s and 1930s, basically these two laws were really crucial to the status of Native Americans within U.S. society. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act that granted citizenship to Native people, and it made them politically viable then within the United States. The 1934 Indian Reorganization Act is a very vague language for what was going on here, but what that act did was to support Native self-government, and this was directly contradictory to U.S. policy from the 1850s forward, where the federal government worked to try to diminish and abolish Native American government. This 1934 act was a reversal, And that reversal came about in part because of the activism of Zikala Essa. So Zikala Essa, Ida B. Wells, and Florence Kelley might all be called middle-class women. Every one of them attended college, and they used their college education to carve out paid work for themselves. But I don't want to give you the impression that progressive activist women were only middle-class and college-educated women. The problem here is that middle-class, college-educated women left a long paper trail. So their stories are easier to find and easier to tell. It's much harder to tell stories of working-class women like Clara Lemlich. But I want to reassure you that there were thousands of working-class women. Oftentimes we don't see their story not only because of a lack of paper trail, but because they get folded into unionization efforts in the late 19th and early 20th century. In this case, Clara Lemlich was a union organizer, but that was part of her larger progressive activism. When we look at a person like Clara Lemlich, her activism was the result of frustration and anger. She, as these details indicate, she was an immigrant from the Ukraine. She came to the United States as a teenager, and when she arrived, she began working 14-hour shifts in shirtwaist factories. This was exhausting, and this was a source of her frustration and anger. Even though she was exhausted by the work, she was inspired by her co-workers. The people that she worked with, she had a close relationship with them. She learned how to read English from them. She also discovered that they shared her socialist values. So she began to talk with her co-workers, first in a reading group, and then more broadly, everyone that she worked with, and she started to organize these workers in an effort to reform the shirtwaist factories where she worked. And a shirtwaist, just because we hear this term all the time, it's the shirt that she's wearing. It's a button-up women's shirt. It's basically a female version of a man's shirt. And there were hundreds of shirtwaist factories throughout the urban Northeast in the late 19th and early 20th century. Clara Lemlich's efforts to try to organize workers on the shop floor paid off to a certain degree. Oh yeah, there's my shirtwaist workers. In 1909, shirtwaist workers went on strike. There were somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000. Isn't that awful statistics? 20,000 or twice that number. And the reason for that is we don't have good numbers on how many men and women were employed in these shirtwaist factories. But we know that somewhere between 20 and 40,000 workers went on strike late in like October of 1909. It was a general strike of these shirtwaist workers. They were on strike for 3 months. And I love these images because they give us a great insight into who these workers were. They were largely women, they were largely teenagers, and many of them were immigrants to the United States, which you can see because of the non-English abolished child slavery banner. The police did not receive the strike very well because the police and the employers of these shirtwaist workers, they worked together, they collaborated. So the police came in and broke up these parades. They broke up parades of striking workers. In fact, Clara Lemlich was arrested 17 times in one strike, and she had 6 ribs broken by the police. So just reassure you, they were absolutely violent with these workers. The turning point for the shirtwaist workers was when middle-class women reformers decided to join them, women like Florence Kelley. These middle-class women had been working to try to get working-class women to support the campaign for suffrage. And so they thought maybe they could have a trade-off, that if middle-class women joined these strike parades, then they might be able to persuade the working women they were parading with to support women's suffrage. And that ended up being a turning point for this 1909 shirtwaist strike, because when middle-class women joined the parades, the police were less likely to attack and arrest the paraders, because when you arrest middle-class women, then their husbands get all upset and they cause problems for the police. So the police brutality and the arrests abated, and eventually these women ended their strike early in 1910. And they won some workplace improvements. So the factory floor speed-ups, that is, employers who said you have to work faster, you have to produce more shirtwaists, these women workers said, you can't make us work faster. We're just going to go back to our regular pace. So employers agreed to that in the concession that they made to this strike. Their wages went up slightly, and in some places, their trade unions were recognized. So then they could negotiate as a group of workers with their employer for better wages, safer working conditions, and more reasonable hours. Victory, though, in this strike was bittersweet for Lemlich, because even though the workers gained something from it, Lemlich was blacklisted from the garment industry. She couldn't work in the garments trades in New York anymore. The employers knew who she was, and they would not hire her. She ended up getting married, and she moved to Brooklyn. She became a parent, but her activism and advocacy did not end. She believed that working-class housewives, which is what she became, were just as important in advocating for her family as any person who was out there on the shop floor earning a wage. And one of the ways that she advocated for working people was by holding rent strikes. So after World War I, affordable housing became scarce in the New York metro area and in other urban areas in the United States. And so Lemlich led rent strikes. And this is when all the tenants of a particular building, they agree not to pay their rent until either the landlord agrees to moderate the rent or to improve the housing. She did the same thing during the Great Depression, so this was not an isolated event. She thought rent strikes were a really effective way of improving the lives of working people. In fact, Lemlich's biographer argues that her activism in rent strikes contributed to rent control laws in big cities and to public housing construction projects, so making affordable housing available to people who lived and worked in cities. Clara Lemlich, there she is. Clara Lemlich, when she was a grandmother, she retired to a Jewish retirement home in California. This was in the 1960s. And while she was there, you can tell that she was a lifelong activist. She didn't give up. She convinced the administration of her retirement community to support California farm workers who went on strike in 1964. This is the Great Boycott. And it was the initial strike that led to the formation of the United Farm Workers. So she was even involved in this, which I think is pretty amazing. This support for the farm workers, it helps us think about the legacy of these progressive reformers. They were activists for a lifetime. Today, Lemlich, I think, would support farm worker women who protest sexual harassment and sexual assault from their supervisors. So the plight of workers in the United States is ongoing. This is the newest issue that they are working to mitigate. This movement among farm worker women especially, is directly related to the Me Too movement. And the Me Too movement shows us how women activists today, they continue to organize around issues related to their own lives and experiences, which was exactly what motivated the progressive women I've just talked a little bit about. As we think about the legacy of Lemlich, Zikala Asa, Ida B. Wells, and Florence Kelley, we have to confront the changes that have happened over the past century, but also the similarities and the continuities. So some of the changes are pretty clear to us. We do not live in 19th century industrial United States. In fact, the industrial sector of the United States has been greatly reduced over the intervening century. Now our economy is more oriented around service and agricultural work. We've also seen changes in the notion of womanhood. The arguments that women made a century ago about how crucial their biology was to social housekeeping is something that feminism from the 60s and 70s kind of crushed. We also see a great increase in the number of women in the workforce. Some of these changes came about because of, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of these changes came about because of the progressive women activists I have shared with you. Children don't regularly work, and we think that is a good thing. We also mandate workplace safety. We also have maximum hour and minimum wage laws. so maybe we're secretly all socialists, but I won't tell if you don't. We also try to preserve Native traditions. We think there is value in alternate ideas, traditions, languages and religions. And even though there is no federal law prohibiting lynching, we no longer practice lynching as a spectacle and as a regular part of our society. So there are differences and there are continuities. Some of the continuities are the level of women's active engagement in public causes. So what the progressive women did over a century ago, that didn't go away. After women became a part of these activist reform movements in the public sector, they never went away. They're still there. Women continue also to predominate in volunteerism. They also predominate in social work, the work that Florence Kelley did. Women also continue to act on matters that they see as deeply connected to being a woman. And this is something that I think you can see on both sides of pro and anti-abortion, that women are deeply engaged in this issue because they think it's a woman's issue. We also continue to struggle over some of the same issues that they grappled with a century ago. And for this reason, I argue that the activism of these progressive women help us to understand and appreciate the politics of 2018 all the better, like minimum wages. We continue the battle over minimum wage. Where should we set that number? What is the minimum wage that we need, not just to support our basic material needs, but also to give us lives of dignity? The legacy of Zikala Asa and Ida B. Wells is in the campaigns to find missing and murdered Native American women, and also to defend the resource rights of Native Americans on their own lands. With Ida B. Wells, the Black Lives Matter movement is something that she absolutely would have supported, as well as the Sentencing Reform Project that seeks to reform the sentences for African Americans who are more likely to have prison terms and more likely to have long prison terms when compared to white criminals. There you go. And finally, in voting, American women gained the right to vote almost a century ago, after an unprecedented number of women became engaged in progressive activism. And this year, Americans elected an unprecedented number of women to office. And so I think those two things are connected. That suffrage, though I've made the argument that suffrage was something woven through progressive activism, it was significant. It gave women more political power. In fact, some argue that Barack Obama wouldn't have become president if women hadn't disproportionately voted for him. So whether or not you think that's a good thing, that's one claim that our scholars have made. Some of the women that we put into office include foreign-born women, like Pramila Jayapal from Washington State, there on the far left. Sharice Davids, who is a Mohican, and she's elected to the House from the state of Kansas. Kamala Harris, an African-American woman, elected to the Senate from California. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, elected to the House, and she's a Democratic Socialist from the state of New York. And so we do see change in terms of the elected office, but continuity in terms of the way that women have engaged in politics. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I invite your comments and questions.